The word freedom is loaded for the public, and it's also loaded for economists and for people who think about political economy. We just had an election in this country that was a bit of a thunderclap, and it sort of laid bare debates about both economic policy and economic relationships among three things: individuals, markets, and the state. And we'll probably talk about all those boundaries this evening. Going deeper, and gets to the subject of Joe's great new book, there are political economy cross currents about the word freedom. Conservative thinkers going back centuries generally think of the concept of freedom as freedom to, the ability to do something, to have something out of your way. More progressive notions of freedom are often freedom from, the protection from something. And we'll talk about this cross current. Now, it's great to have a conversation with Joe on this subject. I consider Joe a teacher of mine, and certainly a wonderful scholar and mentor, and somebody whose work not only wins a Nobel Prize in our profession, but has had enormous impact on public policy, both directly through his ideas and indirectly through his public service. The new book that Joe has, I'll do my best to be like Oprah Winfrey, probably not as good, but I want to give it a shot. The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. And I highly recommend this book. So let's get to it. I want to start, before we get into the ideas of freedom and the book's theme, just about some economic concepts. So how do you think about the role of economics in the subject of the book? And then I'm going to turn to political economy. What's economics have to do with this?
Well, economics has related to this in two ways. Economists have long been involved in the subject, going back to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, who wrote a book on liberty, which was has been one of the central books talking about that subject for 200 years. And then in the middle of the last century, two economists, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, weighed in on the subject. Milton Friedman wrote a book, Capitalism and Freedom, where he argued that economic freedom was necessary for political freedom, and that at the core of economic freedom, he argued, was restricting what the state could do. It was a minimalist state, and gave rise to, he's thought often as the father of what is called neoliberalism, which has become, was a major doctrine in the last 40, 50 years. And if you just parse out the word, neo means new, and liberal is about freedom. And I argue in the book, there's nothing new about it. It's actually old, and he doesn't get the word freedom right, and that's what a lot of the book is about.
I want to come to exactly that point, Joe, but on what you were saying about Friedman and Hayek, both did believe that economic freedom was important far beyond economics, that it was critical for social freedom. The liberalism to which they refer is classical liberalism too.
Yeah,
so can you go back for us, for everybody in the room, and kind of trace the arc from classical liberal political economy thinkers, Adam Smith and that ilk, to Hayek, Friedman, and the modern political neoliberal movement?
So let me just make one comment about Hayek in that, because he got, Hayek wrote this book, Road to Serfdom.
I have it here. I'm going to talk about it.
And his full book is much bigger than that, though. Oh, yeah, that must
Small
be.
print.
Yeah.
This is actually a first edition. It belonged to a member of the Harvard Economics Department. I bought it at Baker Library for 75 cents.
So And his view was very similar to Milton Friedman's. He wrote a little bit. He wrote in 1944. Friedman was about 1960.
62.
62. And he wrote the book in the moment of Keynesian economics, where we just emerged from the Great Depression, and Keynes argued that there's an important role for government to maintain the economy at full employment, and it was the welfare states in Scandinavia were growing up, and those ideas, and right after that, UK adopted the National Health Service. So what he worried was this increasing role of government would lead to set us on the road to serfdom. That's the title. So that too large a role of government would lead to authoritarianism. So now to answer your question, Smith was actually much more ambiguous about the role of the state than Milton Friedman. He wrote several important passages that were adopted, and all of you know, adopted by Friedman and the neoliberals, which were the invisible hand, that the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. And he talked about you don't rely on the booker, the baker and the butcher for doing what you need out of altruism, but out of self-interest. But if you read the entirety of Adam Smith, what he was saying, this was an important force. And then he talks about the need for all kinds of regulation. And he says that, if you put two businessmen in a room, they'll start conspiring against the public interest. And he's very strong that labor regulation is really important, protecting workers. So he had a much more holistic view about the role of the state. It wasn't really the invisible hand as the only force that you should rely on. So this use of the word liberal, meaning free, is still there in Europe. And so the liberal parties in Europe are what we would call conservative in many ways, but they're very much, what is very interesting, the liberals in Europe, like Margaret Vestager, are for very strong competition rules. And so she was, very strong in attacking the digital, the GAFA. And she was also very strongly in support of digital regulation, because she was also worried about harms that the digital platforms could impose in our society. So even though they believe in free markets, it was not unregulated markets.
Yeah, and just to add to what you say, with which I agree, Smith also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Very much.
And which he actually thought was his best book. It was a book written before The Wealth of Nations, almost 2 decades before The Wealth of Nations, that is more of the view that you're espousing. So that I certainly.
And he didn't. The point I would, and he didn't repudiate those views in his later work, The Wealth of Nations.
Now, again, here's my second Oprah Winfrey moment. This is The Road to Serfdom. Now, one of the reasons The Road to Serfdom caught on so much in this country was actually serialized in Reader's Digest magazine. Unlike Milton Friedman, who was a wonderful writer, easy to read, Hayek is not. If you've read The Road to Serfdom, it's not like Milton Friedman, but DeWitt Wallace tried to make it easy for America and put it in Reader's Digest. But I want you to now define your concept of economic freedom. We've talked about Hayek and Friedman's view that whatever economic freedom is, it's centrally important for political freedom, whether it's the road to serfdom argument of Hayek or Friedman's arguments in Capitalism and Freedom. What's the Joe Stiglitz view of economic freedom? What's the definition?
It's both of the elements that you talked about. Basically, I begin from an economist perspective that freedom is freedom to do. It's your opportunity set. If you don't have any opportunity set, if you only have one thing to do, you have no freedom. So that's why I say somebody who is on the point of starvation doesn't really have freedom. He does what he has to do to survive. So if you expand the opportunity set of the choices that people have, that's expanding their freedom. An important element that I emphasize, and is really one of the crucial ideas here, is that expanding one person's freedom may contract that of another, so that opportunity sets are interdependent. And so when some conservatives say, wearing a mask takes away my freedom, part of my response is yes, but if you give a disease to somebody else and they die, you're taking away their freedom. And we as a society have to balance these freedoms. And most people would say the inconvenience of wearing a mask is not as important as the ability to live. And that goes to issues like gun control. We know that having more guns around leads to more people dying. And the right to carry a gun, AK-47, has to be balanced with the right the right to live and the mass murders and the freedom from fear that FDR talked about. That everybody having a gun means children have to, even in school, have to learn what to do when a gunman comes into your room, into your school, and that the fact that they go through drills on that creates a sense of fear and has consequences. So part of the argument here is that society has to recognize these interdependence and make judgments. And in some cases, those judgments are easy. I think in the cases I just gave, they're easy. Some cases, they're more difficult. And one sees regulations, one has to see regulations through these lenses. 10 Commandments are a set of regulations. The regulation, thou shalt not steal, constrains the freedom of the thief, but the expansion of the freedom to have property and to not worry about the thief is greater than the deprivation. So that's part of, that expanding that potential. Now, one of the things that maybe I didn't emphasize enough, but one has to recognize is a lot of the discussion of freedom and what really worried Milton Friedman on this was government taking away people's freedom. So, I talk about one person taking away another person's freedom, and there is a lot of concern about government doing that. And I emphasize more the role of society, government, collective action in doing two things. One of them, balancing the freedoms in the way I just described, and enforcing those, the freedom to pollute versus the freedom not to be killed from pollution, or our society, our earth burning up. But the other one is collective action expanding everybody's opportunity set through coordination, for instance. There are market failures called coordination failures. An example I give is stoplights, which are a simple regulation that takes away your freedom in some sense, that you can't go until it's green. And yet, if you didn't have that regulation and you're in New York City, you have gridlock. And so nobody can move. So having a coordination which restricts your freedom in some sense expands freedom in a more meaningful sense. And that is a metaphor for a lot of things. So for instance, it's a metaphor. We wouldn't be here in the way we're having this conversation perhaps if we hadn't had the vaccine in COVID-19. That vaccine was based on the mRNA platform that government had financed. And government financed most of the warp, the rapid development, very rapid development on that platform. But if government is going to do that, we couldn't each do that on our own. And probably no private company would have had the resources to do it on its own, to take that risk.
Although, to be fair, I mean, Operation Warp Speed also has Hayekian elements too.
I got to say,
the government allowed private firms to do the work. It committed to buying things but didn't regulate it. So it's probably both. But before we leave this, I wanted to ask you, is your view of economic freedom no or yes but to the neoliberals?
It's more on yes, but it's more. What I'm saying is you need regulations, but you also need to give scope for individuals to do. I mean, if you take away the individual's ability to do things is at the core of freedom and at the core of a successful economy. So there was a grain of truth, but they went too far. And so one tease I give Friedman is he wrote a book with his wife called Free to Choose. Yep. And what I say is really it should have been called Free to Exploit, because he says you should strip away all the regulations. And my response to that is, when you do that, you wind up with monopolies, like Smith pointed out, and they exploit you through market power. And going back to some of my own earlier work, asymmetric information, there are lots of ways that firms can exploit imperfections of information on the part of consumers, and government has a role in stopping that. And we all know, you need banking regulation. None of us could really monitor the banks on our own, and that there's a role for a government to provide that kind of oversight.
Let me ask you about another strain in this. I don't think you speak about it too much in the book. Another Columbia luminary, it was Karl Polanyi, who spent part of his career here. And is part of your view similar to his? So instead of just saying there's individuals and there's markets and there's the state, he has this sort of connective tissue of communities and a fuzzier notion of rights. How do you feel about that? Is that part and parcel of what you're talking about, or something
very
different?
Much, very much so. And what I call for in the last part of the book, when I try to say what is it that we ought to be striving for, is that you really need a rich taxonomy of institutional arrangements that. It's a critique of central planning as well. That's not going to work. It's that you need, as we move, for instance, to the care economy, we're going to need, I don't trust hedge funds for running nursing homes. I think, you ask, when you see hedge funds buying a lot of nursing homes, you start to say, do they have a comparative advantage in managing nursing homes? And at first blush, it might not seem so. And then you say, well, why are they doing it? Well, it may be that they are better at exploiting. They care less about taking advantage of elderly who may not be able to tell whether they're being ripped off. And I feel more comfortable with an NGO, a church group running an old age home. They may not do it as efficiently, but they're not going to be as exploitive. And we have lots of institutional arrangements that, sometimes I think our dichotomy into to marketing state is too narrow.
Agreed.
And by enriching it, we can start thinking more about both checks and balances, each on the other, but also about what kinds of institutions are appropriate for different tasks that we have in our society.
Now I'm, of course, imagining the two of us having this conversation in a Presbyterian nursing home in 10 years, so we'll see. But let me change the channel to the election and current events. So is the elevator pitch for the road to freedom that you've talked about tonight and is elaborated in the book, can that win an election? We just had an election, different concept seemed to prevail. So can it win an election, and if not, why not?
I think it can. I should be honest. I was hoping when I wrote the book that it was the language would be used in the election, and Kamala did try to use some of this language. I think freedom does appeal to everybody as an innate concept that we want, and part of what I was trying to argue for in the book was that the freedom had been captured by a certain segment on the conservative side, and in more modern versions are much less sophisticated than Hayek and Friedman. We had the Freedom Party as the Freedom Caucus. Yeah. In the Republican Party, which wanted to hold up as hostage the whole Congress for their particular views. So it was partly written in the hope that the Democrats would recapture that language and talk about their notion of freedom. So I do, and I think some elements of it resonated. I think that under my interpretation, underlying a lot of what happened in this election was a sense that it was really about a lack of freedom, a lack of people feeling that that they were being their scope for freedom had been very narrow. They were pushed to the wall. It's partly that advertising and had increased their aspirations. I think inequality. There's some evidence on this, empirical evidence, that when you have a lot of inequality, there's an effect called keeping up with the Jones, and that leads people to want to, everybody wants to have more. And there's some empirical tests we can talk about of how people have tried to verify this kind of effect. But it is very clear that a lot of people feel, even though incomes here are so much higher than in poorer countries, they feel they're barely getting by. And that what is unambiguously clear is standards of living for large portions of the population have stagnated. And, Case and Deaton have written the book Deaths of Despair, which is a physical manifestation of this kind of despair. And I think the feeling was that establishment figures like Biden and Harris were not likely to deliver anything. And a view that government was not going to do anything no matter what, who got elected. And so you might as well stick it to the establishment. You know,
Yeah.
that I think was a...
One opportunity, though, may be that I don't think to the extent that you would call the Trump administration conservative, it's not wedded to neoliberalism in any stretch of the imagination. No. So there may be a chance for grafting onto opportunity, about participation. They may use different words, but they may be closer to what you're saying. I do, though, want to turn directly to Trump himself. So your phone rings. It's Trump calling from Mar-a-Lago. He wants you to join him for the buffet with a well-done cheeseburger.
He just called me recently.
As your main I'm okay.
No, that was
so
a joke.
You're there. Now, here's the question. So you're there. The well-done cheeseburger is in front of you, and the question is, what elements of Stiglitzian economic freedom fit the themes of Trump's election victory that you could emphasize? So not you're lecturing him, but you know why he won, you know his themes. Is there any mapping of that to your book? And no is an okay answer, if that's the answer.
That's a hard question. I think that some of it, like a better management of globalization, one of the elements of his, protectionism, I think does fit, and we've had discussions about that before. That neoliberalism was part of the doctrine, was stripping away all tariffs, all management of exchange rates. In that sense, let markets rip, and my theoretical analysis, going back to my work with David Newbury in the 80s, we showed that when there were imperfect risk markets, free trade could make everybody in all countries worse off. So, it was a very specific model, but it emphasized how trade opening can increase risk. There's other work that emphasizes the distributional effects, which have been adverse to a lot of people. And then there's other work that emphasizes that countries' production capacities are endogenous. And the loss of manufacturing capacity and the lack of resilience are a concern to me, as they are to Trump. So I don't think the way he's going about doing it, and random taxes on countries you don't like, and threatening to impose tariffs on people who threaten to use different currencies. I don't think that's a way of creating a good global system. And the issue, I don't think autarky is the answer. There are benefits from trade. It goes back a little bit like we said, Smith on Invisible Hand had an important element of truth. Ricardo's comparative advantage has an important element of truth that we don't want to ignore, but he didn't have the whole story. So he explored but. Okay. So that would be one thing that where we could agree, maybe.
So you should probably finish your cheeseburger because he's not going to invite you back.
I know that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you this. You mentioned globalization. I think of globalization and probably greater technological advance over the past several decades as being very transformative for the economy for good or for bad. There's some people, including probably everybody in this room, who benefited handsomely from those forces. There are people in places that did not. Now, along comes in the present moment artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, which can, with much greater speed perhaps than we saw in the waves of previous technological advance and globalization, transform employment opportunities, communities, and so on. Does that put a magnifying glass on what you're saying? Is this sort of really gasoline on a fire of the need to consider? How do you think about a faster moving structural change?
Very much so. It does, because part of the issue here is speeds of adjustment. That an imbalance between the forces driving adjustment, driving change, and the ability of society to adapt. So, you know, one part of it is that globalization has done well for certain occupations and certain places. You know, you go to Silicon Valley, it's doing very well most of the time. New York is doing well. You know, there are certain places that are doing well, and there are certain places that really are not doing very well. And over time, people move, people change their, you know, the younger people get new skills. So, you know, I think both you and I have a faith that there can be adjustment, but in the very short run, you've gone to school, you've gotten certain skills, you're 45 or 50, and the market changes, and all of a sudden your skills are valued at a third of what they were before. You're in a pickle, to use a Midwestern word. You can't change. So part of what we're talking about here is the speed of change, and AI is maybe putting that on steroids. We don't know yet,
right.
But there is a real risk that it does, and that is really the real threat to our society. Even after the adjustment, it may change the relative demand for different kinds of factors of production. So it will have very big distributive effects even after the adjustment, but the short run effects may be actually devastating.
Let me ask you a couple more questions. That's just a cue for all of you to be thinking of your own questions for Joe. But based on what you've talked about in the book and what you're talking about tonight on economic freedom, can you map that into causes of polarization and distrust in society? Are those related? And if so, how would we rebuild trust? And how important is economic freedom in your conception to do that?
Yeah. So there are several parts of this. One of them is the point that we've just been discussing, which is neoliberalism, because it paid very little attention to distribution. It basically said trickle-down economics will make sure that if we make the pie bigger, everybody will benefit. Has led to growing inequality in the United States. And let me emphasize one part of that is that it is a set of market failures like monopoly power, like the ability of some people to get rich by exploiting other people. So it's the deep failure of neoliberalism in the sense that it didn't constrain the ability to exploit that led to some of the inequality, but some of it is just, even if things have been perfectly competitive, free trade between developed and developing countries will lead to more inequality. So growth and inequality means people live in different worlds. And as you have more inequality, you have, we've had an increase in economic segregation in the United States that's been well documented. If people live in different worlds, they start thinking differently. And they think others are different from them. And so that has contributed to, certainly contributed to the polarization. There's another factor, though, that I talk about in the book, which is that all of us, our views are affected by the media, what we read. And we've decided in the United States to delegate that almost totally to the market. Other countries have, like BBC, the UK. There's at least there's a private sector, but there is an attempt to have a media that has a broad spectrum of views and deliberately keeps an open page, if you want to think of it that way. U.S. has a very polarized media, and I think that's contributed a lot to polarization in the United States. That's a big challenge of how do you keep freedom of speech and all, and an open media. I think the Scandinavian countries have done a much better job than we in the United States have. And their institutions have shown that you can have a state media, state allocation of funds to private media, and it can work.
Okay, I want to close out, at least from me, with going back to the contrast between at least neoliberal philosophy as opined by Hayek and what you're talking about. So I think of Hayek's views as being very consistent with conservatism, and is all about modesty. So in the pretense of knowledge, Hayek warned in a quote about acting on an incorrect belief that we possess the knowledge and the power which enable us to shape the processes of society to our liking. You know, he wrote about, he called it the man on the spot, we'd say the person on the spot, everything is devolved. You argue in the book that we should push for as large a change as our democratic system will permit. That seems like a different level of modesty than Hayek. So help me with that.
Yeah, so there are two things. I mean, first let me say, I think Hayek in many ways was much more sophisticated than Friedman, and a much better grasp of the benefits of market economies. Most of what you study in economics today is based on equilibrium theories where there's no societal change. Those of you who have to study macroeconomics, the models, DSGE, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. They think, the proponents of those think their models are great because they're dynamics, they're stochastic, they're general equilibrium. What could be wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with it is the word equilibrium. The world is never in an equilibrium. And to study macroeconomics from the framework of an equilibrium may be a tool, but don't confuse a tool with the world. And we've seen enormous changes. I mean, artificial intelligence was not part of that model, and what that will be doing to our society. We can't predict that perfectly. That would be an example of the limitations on our knowledge. So that's what Hayek was emphasizing. And in some sense, I would go even further, that the economic system, it's more in the spirit of Schumpeter, the economic system creates the changes that keep the system out of equilibrium. that a good economic system creates innovations. Innovations can't be exactly predicted, and therefore there's an inevitable part of a well-functioning economic system that is never in equilibrium. So that's what he's emphasizing, and I agree with that very strongly. The fact that that is the case means that we cannot know for sure what we're going to do, what we ought to do, how optimally to adjust. And that means that's an argument for moving slowly, or not too rapidly, because you don't know if you take a big jump where that will bring you. There's a second reason, is if you take too big of a jump, you risk not bringing the rest of society along with you. And beliefs, understandings are an important part of societal functioning. You really, if example, if
what they had to prove.
you have to, for a country that's never had an antitrust law, to try to explain to them competition ideas is difficult. And so, if you pass a competition law, people will try to circumvent it because they don't understand the functioning of competition policy. And so there is a teaching function. I'm sure you felt that when you were chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, that one of our main job was to teach the president and to teach the rest of the government what the arguments were, but teaching a broader range of society is even more difficult. So, and part of the reason I wrote that particular passage is a feeling that, sometimes you get a feeling that we need a revolution. We need really to change things very dramatically.
I rarely have that feeling.
Okay. But when you look at the history of revolutions, whether it's the Cultural Revolution in China or what happened in the French Revolution, what happened immediately after those revolutions was not a very pretty picture, or in those revolutions. And so I believe very strongly in a democratic society, but and I don't want there to be no change. And sometimes I have the feeling when people see the discontent that we have on both, in the Democratic Party, you hear some people say, well, just a little bit more education will solve the problem. I think we need more education. It's a self-interested view, but I think it's in general true. More education is better. But I don't think that alone is going to solve our problems. So I think we need more change than we've been having. But in some ways, Trump is on the Republican Party, is supposed to be conservative. He's a revolutionary in many ways. If he got everything he wanted, it would be a revolution. And I think it's a revolution that would not work very well.
Okay, I've got a quick lightning question for Joe, but I'm going to save it to the end. Out of Hayekian modesty, I'm going to turn to you. So I'm going to go parts of the room by parts of the room. I'm going to start over here. Anybody got a question on this part of the room? Yes.
Yeah, Professor, thank you very much. Just to your point about revolution, do you think that that's something inherent and intrinsic that is a foregone conclusion? Obviously, we've seen Russia, China, for instance, you mentioned. Is there one coming in the U.S.? And if so, what's the time frame?
Yeah, please let me know so I can be sure to.
I don't think so. We hopefully have institutions that that provide guardrails, and they were intended to provide those guardrails. I mean, we have a system of checks and balances that almost, I don't want to say guarantees gridlock, which is the negative side, but makes change really difficult. And so even a revolutionary, if he stays within the guardrails, very hard to move very much. And that, I'm sure your frustration, it was a frustration when I was in government. But then you understand when you see a revolutionary why those guardrails are so important. And I think all of us pray that there isn't another January 6th kind of thing where there's an attempt to overturn those guardrails.
Middle of the room. Yep.
Professor, thank you so much for both your time. So I know we talked about AI as an accelerant for globalization, but wanted to focus back on some of your earlier work regarding information asymmetries. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, if you think AI is going towards widening that information gap, because you're having a lot of these corporations expend a significant amount of their capex into AI technologies, or it's going to shorten the gap, because if I'm someone that I could literally go on ChatGPT and query something and get a high-level summary of information. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me partially answer going back one stage in our evolution of technology. When computers came up and internet developed, there was a lot of feeling that the internet would significantly reduce information asymmetries and would eliminate the search. And so all the models in macroeconomics where there's search would be irrelevant. You just type in, where are the jobs, and you don't have to go running around to different places, and you get markets working perfectly. No asymmetries of information. Well, what we found out was that wasn't true, and that's because while the market, for two reasons. One is the market convey price information very efficiently. The internet could convey price information very efficiently. It couldn't convey the rich, textured, qualitative. So we still interview candidates. We don't, when we hire people at Columbia, we don't just look at the internet. We actually talk to them. And so the dimensionality of the space is so large that it can't be conveyed over the internet. The other point is that it turns out that some people are better at using the new technology. And so you wind up, and in this particular case, some people were able to use computers and internet to start doing AI. And so you opened up new, and you have a digital divide. So you opened up new inequality. I expect the same thing will happen here. There'll be some increase of inequality associated with those who who know more about AI. But on the usage side, there'll be some reduction. And so it'll be two-sided.
Okay, on this side of the room, yeah, right there.
Go for it.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
So you talk about monopolies as it relates to corporations, right? And agreed on that, right? That they, once they get more power, they tend to abuse it. But the largest, monopoly is the U.S. Is the government situation. So obviously you have to trust the government. Do you address any of that in your book at all? Meaning to have it a function as it relates to the economy, not everything that is like a genius. And then the only thing that I'd ask then is then how do you look at like California as what they just went through specifically versus a national, on a national view, where there's been a lot of pushback from what they've been doing in the past. And they'd say they're probably the most aggressive, right? And just looking at those and sort of a reset in certainly some areas, if not all.
So on the first part, I talk about trust in the book a lot because one of the points I try to make is that the nature of the economy actually affects people, what they're like, how they behave. If you have an economy where the only, and this is very much in the Smithian tradition, if you have an economy which values only making money, you'll create more people who think materialistically, and there's a little evidence that we as economists train people to be more selfish. There's no doubt that when you do studies of students, that economic students are more selfish. And
Maybe they come to us that way. We don't know.
and that's the question of it.
Yeah.
Is it selection effects, or do we actually help create more selfish people? And I think there's evidence on both, that they are self-selected to be more selfish, but we work hard to we succeed in making them still more selfish. And it's not a surprise when you say that the model of the Homo economicus, somebody rational, is selfish, and you don't criticize that, you just accept that is the way humans are, and it normalizes selfishness. And Smith talked about the importance of empathy.
Yeah, in the theory of moral sentiments, yeah.
In his theory of moral sentiments, that he actually didn't believe that people were selfish or should be selfish. So if we talked about that more, you could imagine cooperative society where you have more cooperatives, you would wind up with more cooperative people. So the argument is that the way our economy has been structured has actually undermined trust in a number of different ways. And there's absolutely no doubt that the financial crisis of 2008 led to a decline in trust in our institutions and, interestingly, in government because of the way that the bailout was managed. So that it's both trust in others, trust in institutions, and particularly trust in government.
So I'm going to grab this mic back to have like a 1-minute lightning round with you so we can let these folks go to a reception with you. So here's my lightning round question for you. 10 years from now, what will be the most popular concept of economic freedom in the country?
Well, we can't predict the future. That was what we said a few minutes ago. So I'm not going to quite answer your question in terms of prediction. Let me tell you what my hope is. And
well, I hope the stock market's higher tomorrow, but I'm not sure that it will.
Well, my prediction is partly that the current Trump administration will be a total failure, and we will have then a more reasonable government, whether Republican or Democrat. I mean, the Republicans, my hope is they'll reject, become a normal party, and so we have a reasonable government, and so a reasonable government will start talking about freedom in the terms that I've laid out, and we will have more reasonable discussions on the balancing of freedoms, freedom to do, freedom from government taking away your freedoms. That will be part of the discussion. But it will be a discussion about how do we balance these freedoms, and how do we more precisely conceptualize the different freedoms that we have. And so, I hope my book puts this subject back on the landscape of discourse. And if in 4 years' time we come back, we have the opportunity to come back, I think there will be a discussion along the lines that I've laid out here, because I think it's what people really do care about. It's more than material satisfaction. They want a broader conception of well-being, and freedom is an important, what we can choose, what we can do is an important part of our sense of well-being.
Okay, we're about to grant you freedom from hunger and freedom to have a drink. And it's in room 540, but first join me in thanking Joe Stiglitz.